The Lowdown, Audio Downloads for Life. The Lowdown, a short history of the origins of the Vietnam War, written by David L. Anderson and presented by Lorelei King. Chapter 1. Why the Vietnam War Matters. Part 1. A Vietnamese Jefferson or a Vietnamese Lenin? All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. First penned in 1776 by the American revolutionary Thomas Jefferson, as the American colonists proclaimed their independence from the mighty British Empire, these stirring words are also the opening salvo of the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. Standing on a platform festooned with red flags and paper lanterns in Ba Dinh Square, a tree-shaded public park in Hanoi, the veteran Vietnamese revolutionary Ho Chi Minh, with penetrating eyes and a disarming wispy goatee, boldly proclaimed his country's independence on September 2, 1945. Just as Americans had done almost 2 centuries earlier in defiance of the British, the 55-year-old Ho declared that Vietnamese patriots were, after many decades of French domination, affirming that all the peoples on the earth are equal from birth, and have a right to live and to be happy and free. Among the cheering Vietnamese assembled for this auspicious announcement were American military officers who had worked with Ho and his Vietminh political front to defeat the Japanese imperial forces that had occupied Indochina and had replaced French authority for the previous 4 years. Envisioning this dramatic scene, and not knowing the tragic saga that would follow, someone might assume that the Americans and Vietnamese had much in common on which to build a harmonious international relationship. In reality, however, the two nations were destined to collide in one of the major 20th century wars that would ultimately cost more than 2 million Vietnamese and more than 58,000 American lives. How could it have happened? That there was trouble ahead should have been apparent. In contrast to the festive and hopeful atmosphere in Hanoi on that warm Sunday in September, the day turned violent and deadly in Saigon, another French colonial center about 600 miles south of Hanoi. Hundreds of Vietnamese gathered in the city center to listen to Ho's address on the radio and to cheer independence. As the boisterous crowd paraded down the Rue Catinat, a major shopping street, small arms fire targeted the revelers near the cathedral. A melee ensued as young Vietnamese broke into buildings hunting snipers, looted shops, and beat up Europeans. A stray bullet killed a French priest standing on the steps of the cathedral, and by the end of the day 3 other people were dead and hundreds had been injured. Obviously, there were serious disagreements about the future direction of Vietnam. Uncle Ho and his Vietminh front inspired many Vietnamese who had suffered political and economic oppression under French rule. French merchants, plantation owners, and government officials did not want to relinquish the economic and social perks of colonial control that they enjoyed. Caught between the revolutionaries and the colonialists, Vietnamese, from peasant farmers to urban entrepreneurs, would be forced into joining one side or the other in this clash. Far from the boulevards of Hanoi and Saigon, and the sweltering rice paddies and rubber plantations of rural Vietnam, other powerful conflicting forces were also shaping this emerging conflict. In wood-paneled, high-ceilinged offices in Washington, Paris, Moscow, and other world capitals, government officials were making decisions on how the future of French Indochina played into the interests of their own countries. During World War II, Nazi occupation and France's loss of control of its Southeast Asian colony to the Japanese had dealt a blow to French pride and profits that Paris now intended to remedy by reclaiming its prized Oriental possession. Leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union, allied nations during the war, warily watched each other in an emerging Cold War and constantly made their own global strategic calculations. Neither of these powerful nations had a colonial interest in Indochina, and both in fact claimed that they desired an end to Western colonialism in Asia. Neither could ignore, however, the value of the harbors, resources, and markets of Southeast Asia to itself or its allies in defense of its own international security. The global confrontation between the conflicting interests and ideologies of the United States and the USSR that dominated world affairs for the second half of the 20th century decisively steered the course of the Vietnamese struggle for independence. The U.S. response to the conflict in Southeast Asia, which would place over 500,000 American troops in Vietnam by 1968, emerged from Cold War and colonialist calculations. The United States itself was a Western colonial power. It had taken the Philippine Islands from Spain in 1898, crushed a Philippine nationalist movement, governed the islands as a colony until 1935, and claimed them as a commonwealth until 1946. In 1945, Washington was in the process of recognizing an independent Filipino regime in Manila and believed that Paris should follow a similar course in Vietnam. Western officials continued to exhibit, however, a colonial arrogance that freedom was something granted to Asians when the parent nation thought they were ready. Despite professions of belief in the rights of peoples to choose their own government, both French and American leaders assumed that they knew what was best for the people of Southeast Asia and sought to decide who should lead an independent Vietnam. Their choices were not Vietnam's choices. Ho Chi Minh had a long and storied career of leading resistance to French rule, and most French officials preferred to see him as a prisoner rather than as a president. Most Americans knew little about Ho. The few who had met him recognized his zeal for Vietnamese independence. Uncle Ho had an additional identity, however, that American Cold War strategists could not accept. He was a communist, as were all top leaders of the Vietminh. Ho Chi Minh was not just a leftist or a radical. He was a communist with a capital C. The violent struggle against what was often brutal French oppression had radicalized the Vietnamese nationalist movement and drawn its leaders to Marxism-Leninism as an answer to Western imperialism. Ho founded the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, studied in Moscow, and worked as a party organizer for the Communist International in the Soviet Union and China. He and his lieutenants were in South China in 1941 working with the Chinese Communist Party when they created the Viet Minh Patriotic Front to fight the Japanese. This split personality of Ho and his adherents, nationalist and communist, confounded U.S. officials from World War II through the American War in Vietnam in the 1960s and 1970s. Was the Viet Minh Front, and later its successors, such as the Viet Cong of the 1960s, a force to be opposed or to be accepted? Were the Vietnamese revolutionaries following in the footsteps of Jefferson or Lenin? Washington was no friend of French colonialism or Vietnamese communism, and initially sought to remain neutral in the emerging fight between the French and the Viet Minh. But America's big-picture strategists would find this neutrality impossible to maintain. Part 2. Nam is a place, not just a war. For many Americans, the word Vietnam, or simply Nam, refers to an event or a thing, and not a place. They might say to a veteran, "Were you in Nam?" They are not asking the former soldier if he was in the country of Vietnam, but rather they are asking if he was in the Vietnam War. During the war and afterward, many veterans spoke of being in the Nam. Adding the definite article is not just shorthand for the Vietnam War. It conveys the idea that this war, this place, this thing that they encountered was itself alive, some kind of living being, some kind of monster. Vietnam was unknown and alien to most Americans, and even those who encountered it in person had little understanding of what it was. As the novelist and Vietnam combat veteran Tim O'Brien has remarked, when a booby trap or landmine suddenly erupted in pain and death, it seemed that the very ground itself was the enemy in this strange.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?